All right, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this symposium. There are many ways that deep nets are being leveraged to answer cognitive neuroscience questions. We now think of deep nets as model systems: the zebrafish, the macaque, the AlexNet. Many approaches are varying architecture, either at a large scale or at different circuit level mechanisms to try and understand the representational consequences. And I suspect you'll have just seen some elegant examples of this right before. But I want to highlight what perhaps is a different way these networks can be used, and that is to use them as little representation makers. So you fix the architecture, and then you can vary the input experience or the goal or the representational pressure being put on this, and this creates a hierarchy of different candidate feature spaces. So to illustrate what I mean by feature space, you can think of this as a high-dimensional space, where here the axes are deep net units or feature detectors, and each image is a point in this space because it drives each of the deep net units to different degrees. And with these feature spaces, we now have new empirical leverage to answer some unresolved debates about the nature of object representation. So a little background. There are seminal results that have showed that along the ventral stream there are a few regions that show selectivity for a specific domain: letters, faces, bodies, scenes. These regions are thought to have specialized feature spaces devoted to their category, with lesion data indicating selective functional roles. And here, information about what a region does is in the overall response activation. That's where we think the information carrying signal is. But there isn't a module for every category, and there can't be. So how are all the other categories of objects represented? And the main theory here is that they're represented using distributed codes across a large-scale population of neurons with more general purpose features. And here, it's the patterns across the entire population, both high and low responses equally, that are thought to code information about each category. And there's sort of an uneasy tension between these views. Are they compatible? Are they opposed? Are there really two different kinds of object representations and readout mechanisms from this cortex, depending on the kind of thing you're looking at? And a look into the topography gives some ideas. So, for example, we've learned that the face, body, and scene regions are located within larger zones of cortex that have systematic but weaker response preferences to big objects, animals, and small objects. So these category selective regions are meaningfully integrated with the response profiles of other objects. And this result invites an integrated feature space hypothesis, which will be the focus of this talk. And that is, suppose that this cortex reflects one large-scale, integrated set of features, and that is a set of features designed to tell apart all categories from all other categories. And say these features are smoothly mapped across the cortex. Perhaps in this feature space, faces stick out from other categories, and so do scenes. In other words, maybe face and place selectivity are different facets of an integrated feature space that can represent all categories. Sadly, there was no real way to operationalize rich enough feature spaces to test this idea. And then came AlexNet. In fact, deep convolutional neural networks trained to do multi-way object categorization provide us with exactly the kind of representational space we needed. First, they have integrated feature spaces. That is, there's no specialized units allotted for some categories. All features in one layer are weighted combinations of all features in the layer below. Second, they're trained to do multi-way object categorization, so their goal is to represent all categories jointly, with features general enough to support this task. So I'm going to take you through some of the questions we've been asking with these deep neural networks. The first thing we asked was, can category selectivity arise without specialized mechanisms? So we took an AlexNet trained on ImageNet, and we basically did deep net fMRI. We showed it the localizer images of faces and scenes and bodies and objects and scrambled, and localized units the same way, following the same procedures. And then in those units, we looked at the responses to different categories, and we found robust category selective signatures in their univariate response. So even though this is an AlexNet without any specialized features for faces and places per se, you can still see this signature of a higher response to faces than other categories in these subsets of units. Next, we looked at the patterns of activity and the relationship among those patterns across these 8 categories in both FFA and PPA. And this has always been one of those sticky data points. We know that there's systematic and informative structure about non-face categories in the FFA, but why? Can the face selective units from the integrated feature space predict this structure? And the answer is they can, quite robustly. We found a really strong correspondence between the brain RDM and the model unit RDM. And this isn't just for one layer, but generally emerges over the layers. So here you can see, across the face selective units we identified, and these are the scene selective ones, that you see a reasonably good correspondence with the brain RDM. This raises a new question. Will any sufficiently rich feature space be able to account for this structure? So to explore this idea, we trained 2 more models, one on faces to do face recognition, and one on scenes to do scene categorization. And then we looked and found, in fact, these layers also show a selective response. So this univariate selectivity was actually one of the things that led to the idea of having specialized features in the first place, but it turns out this signature doesn't distinguish between these alternatives. And if we look at the pattern similarity, we actually find that the specialized features don't do as well. So here in red, these are, this is the representational similarity in face specialized features. This is the representational similarity in scene specialized features. And in general, the integrated feature space was doing better. But if you're noticing like, oh, this is pretty good, we thought, yeah, what if we combined the integrated ones with some specialized one? Will we do even better? And we tried this, and the answer is no. In fact, the specialized features aren't actually contributing any unique variance. Less than 1%, all of the variance is coming from the integrated model. And what this tells us is not just any feature space can capture this structure. Yeah. All right, so to give some intuitions about this feature space, here you can see these images from these 8 different categories plotted in a multidimensional scaling plot. So each dot is an image, and when they're nearby on the plot, they're nearby in this high dimensional feature space. And you can see that faces hang together and separate out from other categories, which also separate out from each other. So this is that integrated feature space. The specialized feature space really is operationalizing something different. You can really see that the face identities themselves are even more different, which was how it was trained. And there's still a lot of structure for non-face categories, including buildings, which really stick out. But in our data, the FFA response structure among these other categories is more like the integrated feature space than like this special feature space. Okay, but what about category selective deficits due to lesions? That's one of the hallmark signatures of category selective regions. And here's a way to think about it. So if we take this integrated feature space, and so I've just taken the different features and lined them up along the cortex. The key idea to make sense of this is that some features matter more for some categories than others. Makes sense? So if we were to lesion these features right here, that would be like removing these axes from the space. Now, if those ones were particularly useful for separating out faces from all the other categories, then it would be much harder to read out those categories. And so the general idea behind this is that maybe the univariate responses are actually an indicator of the underlying readout, that high responses are actually signaling the information. And so we tested this. So we took our face selective units and we measured the overall activation to all 1,000 categories in the ImageNet database. And then we lesioned them and we measured how much each category was hurt in terms of its overall recognition after the lesion. So you can see the categories with the highest overall response also took the biggest hit in terms of recognition. And the ones that were at the extremes were mostly animals, like here, hamster and golden retriever. The same thing was true with scene selective units, where here the categories that showed the highest response were scene and big object categories like valley and scoreboard, and those also showed the biggest hit in categorization accuracy after the lesion. In other words, it is the case that high responses are indicative of functional role. So, given this integrated hypothesis, we've shown that it has signatures of category selective regions, both univariate, multivariate, and even lesion data, without requiring any category specialized mechanisms. But what about letters? Now, letters are an interesting domain because they're learned later in childhood and they require a lot of practice. I know because I have a kindergartner. Is all that effort creating some sort of letter specialized feature space? We explored this by asking the question, can letter representation also be accounted for with an integrated space? So to do this, we used a behavioral experiment where you just have to categorize letters. So if your target is an A, you're shown a series of letters and you have to say yes, no, yes, etc. And what we did is measure the time to reject the letters that weren't A's as an index of how similar it was to the target. And if you do this for all pairs of letters, then you can get a behavioral similarity space that underlies our ability to categorize these letters. So you can see it's harder to tell apart an I and a J and much easier to tell apart an I and an M. All right, so now we can ask, what kinds of feature space predict this structure? And here's what we found. So we trained a model this is an AlexNet trained on ImageNet, and this is an AlexNet trained on letters. And in general, it's the object-trained network that does a better job predicting the similarity among these letters than even the letter-specialized network. General object features are best accounting for this even out-of-domain similarity structure. But there's a little bit of room between the model and the noise ceiling of the data. Maybe that's a little bit of letter specialization. So we tested those ideas a few different ways. We took the object-trained network and we fine-tuned it on letters. We also took the network and we made different possible branching points where we set aside a smaller network that could learn letter selective features but building off of the fixed object network. And unfortunately, none of those closed the gap. In fact, the degree to which we introduced more letter training, it actually impaired the fit to the behavioral data. So really, this gap remains unexplained, and it's general object features that seem to be best accounting for the similarity among letters. So back to the integrated hypothesis, this can also account for perception, and we have generally pointing to the view that high-level visual behaviors are supported by an integrated feature space designed to separate all categories. Okay, but what do I mean by all categories? Like, is dog a category? What about different dog breeds? Not to mention that visual experience is rich and doesn't come nicely categorized even if you are struggling with the taxonomy. Multiple things from multiple categories are in there at the same time. And really and some things may not even have categories at all. And we'd like our visual learning systems to be able to operate over any view. But what's the representational alternative? So we were inspired by this paper in 2018, which changed the goal from 1,000-way object categorization to 1.2 million-way image level classification. That is, to try and make every image separable from every other image. And what they found was that images from the same category naturally ended up nearby in the output space, even though that wasn't part of the explicit goal. And that's just because there's a lot of structure in the world, and the prior of the deep convolutional neural network helped to discover that emergent structure. But 1.2 million labels is a lot. So what we wanted to do was try and make a model that learned like this, but without any labels. So we built an instance prototype contrastive learning system. And here's how it works. So you have an image, or the world, and what the DeepNet does is take a few different samples from it, 5 samples. These are augmentations. I think of these a little bit like proto-eye movements. And it runs them through the deep convolutional neural network and maps them into a 128-dimensional space. Now, how do you learn good structure in this space? Well, the way the learning algorithm works is it takes those samples and tries to move them closer to each other, the instance prototype. And it tries to make it separate and far from all the things that are in a lightweight memory queue, basically reflecting recent memory. So I think of this as a little bit like a hippocampal function. And so what we found is this model shows emergent categorization capacity, actually at the same accuracy level as the 1.2 million way supervised models. And now we can ask, does it show brain-like representation? So we tested this in 2 different data sets. So I'm going to show you data from anterior occipital cortex. In this data set, which has 8 items that vary in their orientation, and another data set that's 72 inanimate items. So here's this first data set. In blue are the IPCL models, and in orange is the category supervised model match. And what you can see is that both the instance level models, which have no supervision, achieve the same level of performance as the category supervised models. And in this data set, they even reach the noise ceiling. In the second data set, we also see parity between these 2 kinds of models, though there's room to grow for these finer grained distinctions between inanimate objects. So the broad result here is that you can arrive at this same feature space with self-supervised instance level representational pressure. You don't even have to presuppose categories. But I also want to highlight that there's still representational structure that these deep nets aren't capturing. So I just showed you the finer grained shapes in anterior occipital cortex. We don't quite reach the noise ceiling, and we tried a bunch of things, different architectures. There's new contrastive learning models that do even better on categorization. We tried training IPCL on broader visual diets that include mixtures of faces and places and objects, and nothing improved this fit. Also, back to the letter similarity data, despite our efforts to fine-tune, we never were able to close the gap. There's still reliable structure in the behavioral similarity space that's unaccounted for, which makes me think that what we might be running up against here is an architectural limitation. There's structure that deep nets just aren't capturing. So what is missing? I think there's some insights into this that have been nicely demonstrated by this behavioral work by Katerina Magri. So she had people take those same 72 items that were used in this data set, and then she had them drag and drop them to be arranged by similarity of different kinds of similarity. In this case, she had people arrange items by their shape similarity. So ignore the categories and just think about how they're shaped. And you can see boxier things and rounder things and things with handles and such. And what she found is that this representational structure really beautifully isolates and captures this occipitotemporal cortex better than any other similarity space we measured. And so I think what this points to is a more geometric rather than categorical kind of representation that the deep nets haven't quite discovered yet. So, to sum, I started out by posing the idea that object representation along the ventral stream is supported by an integrated feature space, and that deep convolutional neural networks might be just the tool to help us discover and articulate this hypothesis. I showed you data that this kind of integrated feature space can capture a lot of the category selective signatures, univariate responses, structure and multivariate responses, and even predictable lesion effects. And that it can account for letter categorization in a behavioral task. Finally, I showed you some modeling work that shows that you don't even need to presuppose categories at all to arrive at this integrated space. And that opens the door to learn over a much richer set of visual input. So here's a DeepNet-inspired view of the visual system. Classically, we've posed the question of vision as understanding the route to category information. And I think this work invites a shift away from focusing on categories and specialized mechanisms towards a goal to distinguish everything from everything else using an integrated set of features, which can apply to any view. In this way, we can sample the world directly to help situate this space. And I think these features are smoothly mapped along the cortex, and that really enables selective readout from higher order areas, making different facets of this space accessible from their high responses. Finally, I wanted to highlight the way we're thinking about these empirical computational results. So I think of these feature spaces as cognitive level representational hypotheses without a commitment to the mechanisms per se. So it doesn't necessarily matter to me whether or not you think backpropagation is biologically plausible. I'm interested in the feature space as the artifact. And now it's even being shown that it's possible to arrive at these spaces through different routes and architectures. So I think that justifies a bit this stance. And of course, we know these models are definitely getting things wrong representationally. There's adversarial examples that have an over-reliance on texture, but the argument here is that this doesn't make them useless. Here we leverage the idea that the degree to which they get things right can serve as a sort of computational existence proof. So these models are giving us inferential purchase on arguments about what's learnable from the input, given what kinds of constraints. And in doing so, I think we now have really exciting new leverage into the nature and origins underlying our ability to recognize objects in the world. Thanks.